This is the second meeting of the Gonzaga Socratic Club for this academic year. We've had a great start with a talk on the Oxford Socratic Club, which is our namesake, which was presided over by famous Christian apologist C.S. Lewis. Although, as our speaker reminded us, he did not start the Oxford Socratic Club. He was involved from an early stage. But we follow the model provided by the Oxford Socratic Club in seeking to reflect philosophically on Christian worldview issues. And why the Socrates? Well, we follow the Socratic injunction to follow the argument wherever it leads. And that means to try to think long and hard and carefully on issues about Christianity, Christian theology, Christian philosophy. Christianity is very much a historical religion. If you look in the roots, of course, in Judaism, the story of God's interaction with his people is the heart of the Jewish scriptures, and that idea of God at work among his people is one that shifts right into the New Testament and the Christian scriptures. How should we think of the relationship between Christianity and history? How do we conceive of God's work in the historical process, especially in the context of the church, which he has established as an institution in history to affect the world? Our speaker today, Jonathan Armstrong, Assistant Professor of Bible and Theology at Moody Bible Institute, Spokane, will address these questions for us by looking at resources drawn from two early Christian sources, Eusebius and St. Augustine. Professor Armstrong has a master's degree from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and a master's and a PhD from Fordham University, where he worked as a research assistant to Father Dulles. He's interested in a number of issues that relate to the early Christian period, and has written a book that's soon to be published by Mellon on the role of faith in the foundation of the New Testament canon. So join me as we welcome Professor Armstrong to speak on historiography in Eusebius and St. Augustine.
Thank you, Dr. Calhoun. Thank you, Dr. Priest, for your willingness to review this work afterwards. Thank you, those of you who come out to share your evening tonight. I know you could have been doing many other things. I'm very grateful that you come here for this venue, so thank you. The title of the paper is Historiography as a Model of Theological Method in Eusebius of Caesarea and Augustine of Hippo. To give you a snapshot of where I'd like to take this tonight, I'm exploring the historiography, or the approach to history, of these two church fathers, to see if that is a useful way of comparing their theological approaches generally. Eusebius and Augustine both have given us these marvelous works of church history. I'm going to take us through a little bit of a journey in analyzing the way they approach history and seeing if we can find if that's a useful window into their different theologies as well. Eusebius of Caesarea and Augustine of Hippo are traditionally considered to be rival architects of ancient Christian historiography. In their Magna Opera, the Ecclesiastical History and the City of God, they advocate vastly different visions of the place of the church within history. For Eusebius, the church is the consummation of history. Constantine's coronation reveals that the church stands as heir to all the greatness of Rome. In the words of Charles Norris Cochrane, to Eusebius, the glorious and unexpected triumph of the church constituted decisive evidence of the operatio Dei, that is, the hand of God in human history. On the other hand, for Augustine, to whom the collapse of the Roman Empire was a present-day reality, the church could anticipate neither ineluctable exaltation nor certain disaster. The purpose of this paper is to compare Eusebius's and Augustine's actual use of history to evaluate whether their historiographies can serve as a window into their overarching theological projects. As we shall see, for Eusebius, the historical narrative revolves around the spread of the apostolic witness. Augustine, however, moves out from his comprehension of the church. For Augustine, the church is the central and, if you will, the unmoved part of Augustine's narrative. We see in the historiography of these two authors the clear foundational difference of their theological approach in general, I argue. Eusebius in his theology continues to emphasize the apostolic witness. Augustine unfolds his theology with a profound sense of the unity of the church. In order to explore this set of questions, I'd like to follow two lines of inquiry, and this I will use to structure my thoughts tonight. First, we will compare the framework of Christian history as conceived by Augustine and Eusebius. Secondly, we will compare the structure of the historical narratives as delivered by Eusebius and Augustine, which means that I'm going to take you into the detail of the way that they actually lay out their histories in a very matter-of-fact way. We'll find that Augustine and Eusebius have massively different approaches to history. And finally, concludingly, we'll reflect on the usefulness of using the historiographies of these two church fathers as entry points for understanding their theologies in general. I believe that we find that a comparison of the approaches to history of these two church fathers delivers considerable insight into the difference of their approach to theology as well. Okay, let's dive into the actual project. So firstly, let me examine the framework of Christian history according to Eusebius and Augustine. This is the extent and nature of Christian history for these two authors. The first aim for the historian when writing history is to identify a subject whose identity remains essentially unchanged, though located in a continually changing historical context. In a word, history demands a theme, and this theme must remain continuous, at least in its essence, despite the discontinuity of the historical context. What is the theme that Eusebius appeals to? What is it that he identifies as the subject of his history? Let's look at this by looking at the vocabulary that Eusebius develops for discussing this subject. Eusebius and Augustine develop different vocabularies to express the subject of their church histories, that essential, continuous element in the narrative that makes the account a single story. In recounting the journey of the Christian tradition from the apostolic kerygma to the glories of imperial dominance, Eusebius appeals to the criterion of, quote, orthodoxy, in order to decipher the heroes from the heretics. As astonishing as it may be, the term orthodoxy is approximately as late in coming as the 4th century creeds with which they are still intimately associated. According to the analysis of Richard A. Norris, the term orthodoxia seems to have been introduced into the Christian vocabulary by Eusebius of Caesarea. Let me give you just a little statistical evidence to try to substantiate that claim, that Eusebius is actually the one who injects that term orthodoxy into Christian vocabulary. We have one use of the term orthodox from Clement of Alexandria, of course in the late 2nd century. We have one, and however, with Clement of Alexandria, we have him using the term in such a way that it's very clear that he anticipates that his reader would not understand necessarily what he's talking about. We have an occurrence of the term orthodoxy with Irenaeus of Lyon. Hippolytus of Rome also uses the term once. Methodius uses the term once. He also has a character in a dialogue named Orthodoxus, but aside from that, he only uses the term once. Figures that we might anticipate would use the term a lot, although Latin figures such as Tertullian or Novatian are surprisingly silent. They don't use the term orthodoxy. On contrary-wise, Eusebius used the term 15 times, which, given the background of authors before him, is a surprising statistical rise. Suddenly we have some serious usage of the term. And Eusebius, reading through his narrative, uses this term very significantly. Also, for just by way of charting out that trajectory, in the historians who follow Eusebius, Sozomen, Theodoret, Socrates, other of these early church historians, they will use that term orthodoxy a lot. So they're definitely identified in Eusebius, that term orthodoxy, as the heart of the narrative. Okay. In retrospect, it's perhaps only reasonable that the term orthodoxy did not enter circulation until Eusebius became the first to construct a comprehensive account of the Christian history. That's one of the things that I love in examining Eusebius' historiography. There's, given the novelty or the newness of what he's doing, he's forced very much to identify what is that continuous Christian body that is the true expression of the church throughout. For Eusebius, is called orthodoxy. In orthodoxy, the term, it signifies a deposit of faith, the Christian tradition. It, in fact, signifies precisely what Eusebius is looking for, a word to describe the preservation of a set of doctrines through time. And in Eusebius' vocabulary, orthodoxy also signifies Christianity as lived according to the apostolic tradition. So much for Eusebius. How is Augustine's project significantly different from that? Augustine's vision of the continuous element in Christianity is notably different. Instead of framing Christian history within the bounds of orthodoxy, as Eusebius had done, Augustine prefers to describe the eternal element in the history of the Christian movement by appealing to the term Catholic. As printed in the Patrologia Latina, Augustine uses the term Catholic and its derivatives nearly 3,000 times, while documenting the term Orthodox and its derivatives a mere 6 times. And just to dive into the statistics there briefly again, Augustine writes so much, he uses all kinds of words many, many times, but this occurrence of nearly 3,000 occurrences Catholic and its derivatives is terribly significant, especially when you put that up against how many occurrences Jerome and, for example, Ambrose of Milan, two contemporary Latin authors, will use that term Catholic. About 100 for Ambrose, about 200 for Jerome, but far, far fewer than the 3,000 that we see almost documented in Augustine. Augustine certainly didn't coin the word Catholic. No, of course, we leave that probably to Irenaeus or an earlier author. Yet he was one of the greatest early champions of the word as a theological term. For Augustine, Catholicity, or communion with the universal church, was the essence of authentic Christianity. In commenting on the article concerning the church from the Creed, Augustine explains, this same is the holy church, the one church, the true church, the Catholic church, fighting against all heresies. As for heresies, they went out from it, as unprofitable branches pruned from the vine. It is significant that for Augustine, the essence of heresy is not the denial of the apostolic tradition per se, as it was for Eusebius, rather disassociation from the Catholic communion. Augustine and Eusebius' conflicting conceptions of the framework of Christian history can be explained, at least partially, by examining the sources that were available to each author. Familiar with the literature that appeared immediately after the Gnostic crisis, Eusebius orients his narrative around the transmission of the apostolic tradition. Eusebius is hugely influenced by the 2nd century and the Gnostic crisis. This theme had dominated the writings of the church fathers of the 2nd century. Augustine, however, appears to have had read only a select few Greek treatises from the 2nd century and only in Latin translation. He never acknowledges the writings of any of the apostolic fathers. The first church father whom Augustine certainly read is Irenaeus, whose Adversus Heraseus, Augustine was the first to quote in Latin. So this huge crisis in the 2nd century, which we call the Gnostic crisis, which so imprinted itself on Eusebius' telling of church history, Augustine is virtually unaware of or does not, or chooses not to interact with whole. Augustine had access to Eusebius' most prominent works. Those would be Rufinus' translation of the ecclesiastical history, Jerome's expanded edition of Eusebius' Chronicle. It is therefore reasonable to assume that Augustine could have known the ante-Nicene authors whom Eusebius discusses. However, Glenn F. Chestnut argues persuasively that Augustine relied upon Eusebius's chronicle, that's the very much abbreviated skeleton version, if you will, of the church history, rather than the church history in the City of God. And in his conclusion, it would seem to be confirmed by the absence of any discussion of the development of early Christianity in the City of God. Sometime after 417, Augustine commissioned the Spanish presbyter Paulus Orosius to compile a compendium of the history of the Roman Empire as an aid to help him write more quickly and confidently De Civitate Dei, a work which is more oriented toward the theory rather than the facts of history anyway. As could be anticipated, Orosius also never discusses the forging of orthodoxy, the single most prominent theme in the early books of Eusebius's work. So, that's the end of my first point, just looking at the way that Eusebius and Augustine framed their histories generally. Let's actually look now, I'm going to dive you into a quick structural analysis, if you will, of what actually is Eusebius and what do Eusebius and Augustine actually present in their historical pieces. What topics do they actually talk about? Where might there be overlap in comparison? Let's compare now the outlines of the histories of Eusebius and Augustine. We shall begin with Eusebius's, not only because it is chronologically prior, but also because it is far less intricate than the City of God, and can be laid out in relatively few moves. Eusebius's work is neatly divided into 10 books, and the content covered in each of Eusebius's books has a clear pattern. If we're to accept G.A. Williamson's analysis of the content, and so I'm following Williamson here closely for his division of books in his classic translation, The Church History, from Christ to Constantine. If we accept his analysis of the structure, except for books 1, 9, and 10, each book is structured essentially the same. From books 2 to book 8, Eusebius fixes his narrative chronologically to the rulers of the empire, and then, in the same time period marked out, explores the happenings in the Christian and sometimes Jewish communities that occurred during this same period. So, following that schematic, in book 2, Eusebius chronicles the events of the empire and the church from Tiberius to Nero. That would be 14 to 68 AD. In book 3, Eusebius chronicles the events of the empire from the church and the church from Vespasian to Trajan, or 69 to 117. Book 4 covers from Trajan to Marcus Aurelius, 117 to 180. Book 5 covers from Marcus Aurelius to Severus, 180 to 211. Book 6 covers from Severus to Decius, that is 211 to 251. Book 7 covers from Gallius and Gallienus, from 251 to 268. Book 8 covers from Diocletian to Maximian, 284 to 310. We could disagree with the neatness of G.A. Williamson's analysis, and indeed there are points of friction that should be mentioned. Let me just mention a couple. For example, Book 6 of Eusebius's history is given over almost entirely to the biography of Origen. We may claim that Book 6 covers the period from Severus to Decius, which it basically does, but this is not an even-handed analysis of all events taking place in church history between these two dates. The book is solidly an early biography of Origen and dedicated to the exploration of his scholarly work. Book 8, too, is also very tied to a specific theme. It's a transcript of martyrdom stories. If we look at Eusebius's narrative more generally, too, books 1, 2, and 3 seem to flow clearly. Most of my students can make it through at least book 3. We have a description of the ministry of Jesus, the ministry of the apostles, the ministry of those who were ordained after the apostles. But after the first 3 books, the narrative's coherence seems to spin apart a bit. And then we're all lost at that point as to what exactly is structuring Eusebius's stories. He has tons of traditional elements that he puts in, no doubt from the church library that he had access to, what was later, what had been originally Origen's library in Caesarea. So he has tons of traditional elements that he could put in, but trying to figure out exactly what helped him make his decisions as he decided what to put where is genuinely a mystery. Yet, I'll continue to basically express my agreement with G.A. Williamson that Eusebius follows this basic pattern of taking a time period demarcated by a set of Roman rulers and emperors, and then putting church historical stories into that framework. One thing is uncontroversial. So we could disagree with Williamson's analysis, but here's something that I very much do not want to disagree with. Eusebius most certainly mixes the history of emperors along with that of bishops throughout the narrative, until he finds opportunity, at last, to tell the story of the emperor, Constantine, who served as bishop to the bishops of the whole empire. For Eusebius, secular and sacred history are inextricably mixed. And that's what I've been digging for in all of this analysis. Let's turn to Augustine. What does he actually do with church history in the City of God? I don't know what your experiences are for those of you who are readers of Augustine's City of God, but the book is always billed as a church history, or a historical theology perhaps, but if you read it with that lens, it's very different from any other historical theology that you're going to approach. What does Augustine actually cover in the book? First of all, it has a very different shape than Eusebius's work. Augustine has some very helpful comments that he makes about the structure of his work. He gives those to us in Retractions, 1169. Augustine tells the reader that his original plan for the City of God is this. The first 10 books deal with the philosophies that oppose the City of God, and within those first 10 books we can further subdivide. It subdivides itself very naturally into two parts. Books 1 through 5 deal with the collapse of the Roman Empire. Books 6 through 10 deal with Roman and Platonic philosophy. Augustine continues to tell us in the Retractions that the second part of his book, that is books 11 through 22, divide into three subsections. Books 11 to 14 deal with the beginning of the two cities. Books 15 to 17 deal with the development of the two cities, and books 18 to 22 finally end with conclude with the end, that is the purpose or telos of the two cities. Let me give you a very quick summary of what Augustine talks about in this magnificent historical theology. Book 1. Augustine writes about the sack of Rome, concluding that the atrocities were committed in accordance with the standards of war, but any compassion shown to the Romans was due in fact to Christian influence. Augustine mentions some Roman historical figures, Regulus, Lucretia, Cato, as examples from Roman history, but there's no attempt to unfold these histories systematically. Rather, they're examples only. Book 2, Augustine seeks to demonstrate that the Roman experienced tragedy even before Christianity came to prominence. Augustine mentions the rape of the Sabines as an example of the injustices of the Romans even during the people's early history. Augustine closes Book 2 by urging the Romans to cease worshiping the traditional Roman gods. Book 3 is Augustine's most traditional survey of Roman history, so if you're looking for that bit, that's Book 3. He deals with the crises in Roman history all the way from the destruction of Troy, the untimely deaths of the kings of Rome, the carnage of the Punic Wars, all the way to the era of the coming of Christ. Book 4 deals with the rise and falls of empires, implying that the rise and falls of empires, including Rome, should be expected, given the course of human history. He speaks very briefly about the Assyrian and Persian empires, and concludes again that the worship of the Roman pantheon is in no way preserved the empire from collapse. Book 5, so that is the conclusion of that first subsection. Book 5 begins with an extended refutation of astrology and fate, and the book then concludes that the results of battles depends on God's providence. He points to Radagasius, the pagan who was conquered in a day despite the huge numbers in his army. However, very surprisingly, and here we take a turn, very surprisingly, Augustine does not quite turn the tables the way we would expect him to, and say that while fate has nothing to do with the outcome of battles, it's actually the providence of God, and that God is rewarding those who are faithful to him. That's what Augustine does not say, although we can anticipate that he probably expected his reader to think that. expect, as the reader, primed in a Eusebian tradition as we might be, to say that Constantine defeated his enemies despite all odds because God was with him. That's not quite what Augustine says. Rather, I quote from Augustine, "When we describe certain Christian emperors as happy, it is not because they enjoyed long reigns or because they died a peaceful death, nor is it because they subdued their country's enemies. All these and other similar rewards or consolations in this life of trouble were granted to some of the worshippers of demons, as their due. And yet those pagan rulers have no connection with the kingdom of God, to which those Christian rulers belong. Their good fortune was due to the mercy of God, for it was God's intention that those who believe in him should not demand such blessings from him as if they represented the highest good." Augustine continues, "We Christians call rulers happy if they rule with justice. It is Christian emperors of this kind whom we call happy, happy in hope during this present life, and to be happy in reality hereafter, when what we wait for will come to pass." Except for a brief discussion of Socrates and Plato, almost nothing from books 6 to 10 of the City of God contains a character of historical discourse. Rather, the whole section is about Roman philosophy, that is, Varro's concept of civic theology, and Plato's philosophy, concluding that Plato rightly understood that to be happy was a product of knowing the truth, not of outward comforts. Stay with me as I go quickly through the rest of Augustine's work here. Book 11. Augustine resumes his discourse on a historical plane. From books 11 to 17, he surveys Old Testament history and gives his theological commentary throughout. As one enters book 11, one assumes that Augustine will resume a historical narrative when he begins to speak of creation, but when at the conclusion of book 12, about 100 pages later, he comes and is still discussing the creation of the world and how it reflects God's providence, one's confidence begins to wane. Book 13 opens with a discussion of the fall of man from Genesis 3. Thus we see that, again, some motion in the historical narrative, but by the close of book 14, we find that Augustine's purpose in the protracted discussion of the fall of man is, in fact, only to explain whence the city of man. And I quote again from Augustine. "We see then that these two cities were created by two kinds of love. The earthly city was created by self-love, reaching the point of contempt for God. The heavenly city by the love of God carried as far as contempt of self. In fact, the earthly city glories in itself. The heavenly city glories in the Lord," unquote. Augustine opens book 17 with a nod to the story of Isaac and Ishmael as a picture of the two cities. Augustine speaks of Cain's fratricide and how it is mirrored in Romulus's killing of his brother Remus. Augustine reflects on the incredible ages of the antediluvians, as well as the meaning of Enoch's translation to glory in the story of Noah and the ark. The majority of book 16 reviews Old Testament history from the flood to King David, although the vast majority of the book is dedicated to the patriarch Abraham. Book 17 deals with the, quote, prophets of ancient Israel. Augustine uses that term very fluidly, specifically from the time of Samuel to the Babylonian captivity. Do you sympathize with me as I'm trying to go through Augustine's work and trying to find exactly how this narrative is working? What's its mechanic? What's its activating principle? Book 18 is a surprise. And this is the last of the historical books that Augustine, or the books where Augustine is really dealing with historical material. The books 19 through 22 are purely philosophical. Book 18 is the surprise, though. It's a turn in his narrative. At this point, Augustine reviews the same history, that is, from creation back up to the time of the birth of the Savior, but in an entirely different light, all in one book. He reviews the history from the beginning only concerning the city of man. And this is where Augustine is most heavily reliant on Eusebius. He seems to have taken Eusebius' Chronicle, and that's the abbreviated or earlier form of the church history, and used it very freely in his construction of this book. Thus, Augustine covers the same space that he had in the first 17 books of the City of God in a single book about the city of man. For this section, Augustine is heavily indebted to Eusebius' Chronicle. To the modern reader, it can be frustrating that so much of this information is misunderstood. Augustine here delivers a, quote, secular, unquote, reading of world history, or the city of man, in order to serve as a contrast to the history of the city of God that he's been delivering throughout. Let me give a few concluding reflections. What does this mean for the way that they process theology, and how can we, by this examination of their historiography, learn something about their approach generally to theology? How do Augustine and Eusebius approach history differently? How can we witness these differences reflected in their approach to theology? Augustine sees Christian doctrine as the truest reading of history, I submit to you. As he's sorting through different texts and stories to put into a city of God, he's putting in illustrative material only. There's not a clear sequence in place. He's using this for illustrative purposes. He concludes that paganism does not make sense of the actual Roman history, but that the Christian teaching, the Christian worldview, if you will, the Christian story is in fact a far more accurate lens to understand what was happening in the Roman Empire. I submit that to you. We can discuss that at length if you wish. Eusebius, on the other hand, blends his histories together, secular and sacred, inseparably. Why? Because at the end of the day, he does not see church history as separable from the history of the Roman Empire. Remember, for Eusebius, Constantine is going to be the fulfillment of Roman history. Church history is the fulfillment of secular history in that regard. Augustine certainly demonstrates the deeper understanding of Roman culture and literature, far deeper than Eusebius does, of course. And yet it is Augustine who so wishes to consciously separate off Roman history from the history of the city of God. That is the story of redemption that is continued from the Old Testament into the history of the church. The paradigm that Eusebius established dominated the ancient and medieval vision of Christian history. For almost 3 centuries after Eusebius' church history, Christian chroniclers conceived of their task merely as to continue Eusebius' masterful narrative. In 402 or 403, Rufinus translated Eusebius' Historia Ecclesiastica into Latin and appended a 10th and 11th book, thus advancing the narrative until Theodosius' death in 395. In the 5th century, continuing this narrative, in the 5th century, a trio of Greek historians, Socrates, Sosum, and Theodoret, each compiled an ecclesiastical history in conscious emulation of Eusebius, also picking up the narrative where he left off, tipping their hands that they saw their projects as entirely the same as Eusebius's. In the century following, Evagrius drafted yet another Historia Ecclesiastica, and again patterned it after the Eusebian paradigm. And yet, as profound as Eusebius's influence may have been, Augustine emerges as an opponent of the Eusebian optimism even before the first of these Greek historians had placed pen to parchment. While Eusebius viewed the rise of Christianity to imperial power as a vindication of the truthfulness of Christian doctrine, Augustine banished all such conceptions of progress and regress from his philosophy of Christian history. He averred rather that the history of the church rests on a plane neither slanted upwards nor downwards. In every age who reject the opportunity to become lovers of God are undone by self-love. Augustine certainly rejoiced over Constantine's triumphs, but he also warned against confusing the pursuit of Christianity with the pursuit of imperial power. And I quote again from Augustine. Again, lest any emperor should become a Christian in order to merit the happiness of Constantine, when everyone should be a Christian for the sake of eternal life, God took away Jovian far sooner than Julian. Augustine's firm division between sacred and secular history, on the other hand, may be problematic, but from Augustine's perspective, his position was far less problematic than Eusebius's evidently false claim that orthodoxy is self-vindicating. As the Roman Empire toppled all around him, Augustine discovered Eusebius's historiography to be utterly useless for his purposes. Augustine knew he had to start fresh. Constantine's court theologian proclaimed that orthodoxy was assured of victory in every crisis, theological or political, but the undeniable crisis of his own age forced Augustine to devise a new theory of the place of the church within history. He severed the church from her bond to the earthly city, thus releasing her from the fate of Rome. The church did not depend on the empire for her identity. She was the true eternal city. In introducing the world to a universal church, a church whose authority was not tied to the success of empires, Augustine advanced a new theory for the source of the authority of authentic Christianity. Thank you so much.
It's our practice at the Socratic to have a respondent, and Dr. Kreese of the philosophy department here at Gonzaga will respond to Dr. Armstrong's paper.
First of all, I think we should genuinely thank Dr. Armstrong for his paper, which is very rich and I find really very stimulating. It also occurs to me that there are probably many people in the room who know almost nothing about Eusebius and maybe not a lot more about Augustine. And it occurs to me that maybe the best purpose I can serve here this afternoon is to try to explain sort of, if you will, the philosophical or theological significance of what Dr. Armstrong said. And so I'll try to do that, in other words, set his paper in a context in which maybe we could discuss it a little more better amongst ourselves. So the question is historiography. How do we write history? Well, we don't begin actually with Eusebius. In fact, we find that the Bible has its own histories. Perhaps the first history as such is what's often referred to as the Deuteronomic history in the Old Testament that extends through Joshua, Judges, the books of Samuel, and the book of Kings. This history is marked by a certain pattern. So long as the Israelites do what God has asked them to do, as long as they observe the law, they do well, they prosper. But alas, they turn away from God and worship idols, and God punishes them. And then after a time, the Israelites repent. They return. Teshuvah is the Hebrew word. And things begin to prosper. We notice the pattern. Right worship of God corresponds to temporal prosperity. Improper worship of God corresponds to a lack of temporal prosperity. Now, there are exceptions to this, even in the Hebrew scriptures. We think perhaps upon the example of the suffering servant, the Eved Yahweh in the book of Isaiah, or something like that, a person the just person who suffers. Job raises these questions. But, for the most part, there is a lot of this Deuteronomic kind of thinking in the Hebrew scriptures. Now, in the New Testament, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus makes this claim that, for example, that God sends his sun to shine upon the just and the unjust. In other words, there doesn't seem, according to, if we take this line seriously, it seems there is no correspondence, Christ is asserting, between worshiping God properly and temporal prosperity and the opposite. So, what are we to make of this? How are we to solve this? Another way to think about this is that Christ, obviously the central figure of the New Testament, he doesn't exactly prosper temporally, winding up on a cross and all. And so, how are we to understand then this whole problem? One further thing to keep in mind. The New Testament contains a regular history of its own, namely the book of the Acts of the Apostles. And here the pattern is repeated over and over again. A Christian is persecuted. A Christian suffers. As a result of this persecution, though, the church only grows. Stephen is martyred. What is the effect of this? The Christians spread out. And the church begins to multiply more and more and more. Persecution in this pattern leads then to the spread of the church. Now, let's say we're Eusebius. You read, on one hand, we have to be enormously grateful to Eusebius because if he didn't preserve some of the things he did, we would know nothing about him. And we would know even less about the first centuries of Christianity than we do. But he comes across, insofar as a thinker, as an historian in some ways, extremely shallow. He rather clearly says that, yes, we Christians, we suffered for a long time. And he chronicles the persecutions in great detail. We wouldn't know much about a lot of these persecutions either if Eusebius didn't tell us about them. But, lo and behold, when it looked like the game was lost, all of a sudden Constantine came along the scene. And now it looks like smooth sailing for the church from here on. And so Eusebius is often referred to as the triumphalist. Okay, we've got it made now. Things we're really set. Now you can kind of forgive Eusebius for thinking this way, because after all, he himself was persecuted. He spent time in jail. He knew people who were in fact martyred. And, he saw Christian churches being torn down and destroyed, and his friends rounded up. And, it must have seemed like the parousia, when Constantine suddenly converted to Christianity, exactly he did, and it's another question. But, you can't really blame him, I guess, for thinking this way. But Eusebius, he comes across as being one of those who thinks that correct worship of God means temporal prosperity. Now, Augustine, I would have said this a little bit differently, actually, than Dr. Armstrong did. The first 5 books seem to me not to be exactly about Roman history. What they seem to be about, or designed to do, is to refute the claim that there is a correspondence between temporal prosperity and correct worship of the gods. And he does say, I wrote the first 5 books against those who say that the pagan gods are to be worshipped for prosperity in this life. The subtitle of the book is, On the City of God, Conquering Gods Against the Pagans. This is what they were arguing. Eusebius is thinking, in some ways, is kind of pagan about these matters. Now, and Augustine, you see, he's got a very big problem. Because the accusation against the Christians is that, of course, you guys have been ruling the world for not even a century. It's only been less than a century since Constantine. And, it's gone to hell in a handbasket. Alaric and his Goths sacked us in 410 and spent 3 days burning and looting and raping in the city. That wasn't supposed to happen. This was the city that would endure forever. And yet Rome's walls had been breached by this. Okay, well, what does Augustine want to say? He accepts the teaching and he cites it that God makes his rain and the sun, for that matter, to shine upon the just and the unjust, to fall upon the just and the unjust. But he's got to convince people who were thoroughly committed to the view that no, correct worship of the gods would yield temporal prosperity. He's at an extraordinary reform disadvantage. How are we going to convince people who think exactly the opposite not to do this? No. Augustine's a man of no small rhetorical abilities, and it's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary book, but it still seems to me that it's very strange, the whole argument. Basically he wants to say, you guys are all wrong, and that you think empires are important when they're not, and you think that prosperity in this life is key when it's not, and but how would you convince people who are hopelessly committed to these positions of their inerrancy? Their errors. Another way to look at this is, if I could comment, you mentioned the book 18, and you mentioned Paulus Erosius. So Augustine had this Spanish presbyter, something like his own graduate student, who he commissioned to write this book on Roman history, and he wrote it very much according to the Eusebian thinking. And one of the things that Erosius includes in this book that strikes us as preposterous, but it's pretty interesting nonetheless. He says that, if you look at the plagues, there were these many plagues. And then if you look at the persecutions of the Christian church, there were this many. And lo and behold, they match. And you can there's sort of some bizarre correspondence between these two. Well, of course, what happened after the plagues? The Israelites left Egypt, and everything was great. Okay. Well, so now see what's going to happen after the persecutions. Well, something analogous. Constantine's on the scene, and okay, we don't have Moses, but we have Constantine, and everything will be good. And okay, in chapter 52, Augustine basically gives a summary of Erosius' view here, and he says at the end that, well, basically, that Erosius is nuts. Okay, this is quite wrong. Jonathan mentioned this at the end. Augustine departs from Eusebius' thinking about these matters. Augustine, even when Rome was falling, he seemed to think that the really important thing was not exactly whether Rome would fall, but whether the Christians were going to get out there and convert her captors and make them into good Christians. If there's, I guess it's probably pretty obvious by now that I'm more of an advocate of the Augustinian view than the Eusebian. But it is the case, I think, as Dr. Armstrong indicated, for the first few centuries after Augustine, it was more Eusebius than Augustine who predominated within Christian thinking. Sozomen and these others wrote ecclesiastical histories that were largely extensions of Eusebius rather than Augustine. And, you could say that even while Rome fell in 410, around that time, Patrick was up there in Ireland converting the Irish and establishing monasteries there. And it would only be a few years before the Irish were sending missionaries back into the European mainland. And the Romans, the Italians were sending people northward to convert these wild Germans to the Christian faith, and in a way, the church kind of took it in stride, the barbarian invasions, and got about the business of converting them right away. The fly in the ointment, or the thing that I think has to turn the argument into Augustine's favor, of course, was the 7th century and the rise of Islam. Before the end of the 7th century, over half of all Christians and all Christian lands were under the control of the warriors of great Christian churches, including Augustine, was soon wiped out. The African churches, the churches of the East, Jerusalem, Caesarea, Eusebius' church, and really all that remained of the ancient churches was the two principal ones, Rome and Constantinople, and even Syria was in trouble. Well, it's pretty hard to maintain Eusebian view under those circumstances. And this was kind of Augustine's point. You know, we don't know what's going to happen to the church. Right now, let's say in year 400, doesn't look bad. We're doing okay. Some progress. But there is no reason to think that the church won't be persecuted in the future, he says, just as it has been in the past. So, you know, it's not, I guess we're to have...
Would you like to respond?
Actually, I have questions mostly.
Okay, go. Go for it.
Right?
That's good.
Sorry, I'm not more familiar with the
We have a very flexible format.
Great. Then, actually, Dr. Priest, please don't go away.
Yeah, don't go away.
Okay.
Stay there.
So we'll just go.
That's a rule. That's inflexible.
Okay. So here are my questions, and I'm hoping that maybe you can help me take or point my research in a useful trajectory that I'm still trying to search out. Here's my own puzzling, and maybe you can help me with this. It seems to me that Augustine, he's very much going against the tide. You've spelled it out so clearly for us. Not only is his pagan audience going to be very, very reluctant to accept his message, but his Christian audience, frankly, should be very reluctant to take that too, given where we see all of the histories going. So he's got everybody against him, and yet he's very much taking up this new course. What allowed Augustine to do that? So I'm wondering, did the monastic movement, and I don't have a good sense here, but did the monastic movement somehow compel Augustine to look for otherworldly success and to create a history of a spiritual success where it's not visibly represented? Was Augustine so convinced that the signs of erosion that he witnessed during his day would be final, that he took an entirely different route beyond the Eusebian route? What convinced Augustine to take such a route that he did, given that everybody would go against him?
Well, I don't know. Here's some things that you might think about. I mean, one, some people are just really sharp, and you know, they think of things on their own, and they think through the arguments and figure it out. But another thing, you know, an interest in otherworldliness. Well, it is there in the New Testament, talking about discussions of eternal life. And, there is the Paul's suggestion, you know, do not conform yourselves to this world. So on, those would be those sorts of things.
Or Jesus' comment to Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world.
Other things, Dr. Lane is sitting here, and Augustine, of course, was very familiar with certain Neoplatonic books, ones. And those books don't seem to tie to prosperity to this world. In fact, the second 5 books of the City of God, as you know, are written against those who say that the pagan gods should be worshipped for prosperity in the next life. So you be directly swear that with Neo-Platonists. Another thing you might think about is this. Augustine was very concerned, among other things, with the Dominicans in his time. Among W.H.C. Friend, the church historian of conservative stature, has suggested that this conflict within the African church Among other, there are a number of reasons, but he thinks one of the things that was going on is there were conflict between the Roman peoples and the Berber peoples, indigenous peoples here. These peoples extended beyond the Roman Empire, or they didn't understand themselves always as really belonging to the Roman Empire. Monica may have been Berber, his mother. In other words, Augustine was thinking about people outside of the empire, having people a little different. So, I don't know, all of those things, or none of them may have his thought.
And can I ask one, actually something about the Donatist controversy was puzzling to me, because, well, I think this divide between Eusebius and Augustine's approach to history works out nicely in a lot of ways. With the Donatist controversy, it doesn't. Here's a small counterexample that I don't quite know where to square in my own thinking. Augustine's response to the Donatists is, you're a minority position. Donatism is only a North African phenomenon. Come to the great church, will even use imperial force to do it. This incident to me seems to be so contrary to the theology that I think I perceive in the City of God, that I'm quite baffled by it. Here he's saying majority opinion must be correct, and will even use force to bring it about. What am I misunderstanding?
Well, I don't know if he exactly says majority opinion. He does say, he does appeal to Catholicity. Okay, so, and maybe that's what you're thinking. He says everybody else understands this way. You're the only ones who don't. As far as the point about using Roman law to help restore unity within the church, Augustine seemed to have vacillated on that. I mean, at first he was opposed to it, and he didn't think that it would help, and then he says, I didn't think this was a very good idea, but it seems to be working. And a lot of the Donatists had told me, thank goodness, that the Romans came and closed our churches and forced them into yours, because we see that what we thought was going on there wasn't. I don't think that Augustine really saw the Donatists exactly as heretics, so much as there's this dispute, that maybe we should make this clear. So there was a story, may or may not be true, that the Bishop of Carthage, during the time of the Decian persecution, had handed over the scriptures to the Roman authorities. They were traditores. They were traitors. He was a traitor. He had handed over the scripture to the Romans when they were persecuting the church. And so the Donatists argued, this guy cannot be bishop, and anybody that he consecrated can't be priest, and sacraments in the hands of any of his priests are not valid, and so on and so forth. Now there is an heretical issue here, because it seems to say that the validity of the sacraments, the efficacy of the sacraments, I should say, depends upon the holiness of the one performing the sacrament. In other words, it kind of turns the priest into a magician of some sort. Okay, and so, yeah, the Donatists, I guess you could call that heretical, but Augustine never gave up on bringing the Donatists back into the fold. He denied that Cecilia ever handed over the scriptures, and the council sided with Augustine against the Donatists. It is interesting. He did say, okay, let's have a trial. He did sort of submit the question to the Roman authorities to decide it, but I think he knew he was going to win. But we tried to always to work it out. It was a very bitter controversy in the church in those days. There's even a story that Catholics, who could tell, they couldn't tell the difference. And so they would arrest them and throw them in jail together. And, but they disliked each other so much. They, you know, the Donatists would say on that side, the Catholics on this side, they even put up a screen between them to separate the two parties. It was a bitter argument. I guess in the end it only ended completely when Islam and the African church. So why do you think, and why would that sort of tell against the rest of Augustine's understanding of history?
Well, to put it in terms that are very familiar to me from the Reformed tradition, Augustine so supports this idea of an invisible church that the church is not necessarily the victorious party. The church is not necessarily that which is visibly and obviously supported by other social structures. But here in the Donatist case, seems to be, again to use Reformed category, he's very much vouching for the visible church. And sort of has this triumphalistic narrative that he's writing. Happy that you don't see it that way. That was just something that had puzzled and confused me.
Yeah. Well, it strikes me that he does make a distinction between the two, right? And he says at one point something like, you know, God has some whom the church does not have, and the church has some whom God does not have. His attitude towards the Donatists was, you know, let's wait and sort it out. The tares will be sorted out eventually. We don't need to rush to that right now. But I guess I would understand him saying there's a distinction between those two, but he still seems to think that there's a connection between the visible church and the invisible church. The correspondence might not be tight or exact.
Well, to affirm that, he so clearly articulates, he has such a robust ecclesiology, and he's so often using the church's Catholicity as the point out of which he moves. I have to.
Questions, comments from the audience here? Anyone?
Yeah, very interesting paper. Thank you for coming in and sharing this. I suppose I'm a little puzzled or perhaps edging into concern about your characterization of Augustine as a historical writer of history. I suppose I read the City of God, I see a writer with an approach of it, using history, using historical elements. But certainly his project is different. As a writer of history, a Roman sense of a writer of history. And so the difference that you pointed out, is it a true difference or is it a difference of genre?
Good. I wouldn't fight hard to defend my position there. So I'm operating off of a traditional acceptance that we have a difference here in paradigms. Marty Marcus and others back in the 60s. I showed you some articles that would start from that standpoint. But honestly, at the end of the day, I would have to agree, Augustine's use of history is so different. It is very much intellectually an entirely different project. And yet, I do see him grapple and oppose Eusebius' ideas. He makes sure that he has access to Eusebius' product when he uses it heavily in places. I do think in Book 5, I think I read him very much opposing the position that he assumes his readers have, that temporal godliness is going to lead to temporal prosperity, therefore God is going to systematically bless the emperors like Constantine who do his will. I think very much he's opposed to that Eusebian paradigm there and a few other places. But I have to agree it's very different.
Is that Eusebius' paradigm, or is it a series of exemplars? Essentially, in the Roman tradition of history is written by an exemplar of how we conduct our lives, and here is Constantine writing official life of Constantine from his sons in order to persuade him, be like dad, don't go back to Diocletian.
So the question would be, is Eusebius, does he even have a theology behind his use of, I don't think so. I think he does. I translated his commentary on Isaiah, which had previously been translated. And in that text were many others you could look at, but the commentary on Isaiah exudes this Constantine optimism. He's writing Constantine's baptism in as a fulfillment of Messianic prophecy. So in a biblical piece like that, he sees the events of his own day as fulfilling biblical prophecy. I do think there's a theology at play there. He sees Constantine as not just tremendously historically significant, but deeply theologically significant.
Yeah, there's one other category for thinking about history that might be helpful here, and that is a teleological view of history. And Dr. Priest, as you were contrasting various biblical accounts of history and applying it to Eusebius and Augustine, you were talking about rewarding correct worship with temporal prosperity. But if one wanted to give a slightly more sympathetic account of Eusebius, I haven't read Eusebius, I'm just basing this on what I've heard today, one might say that he has a more teleological view of history. That it's not that God is rewarding the church with temporal prosperity, but that God has a telos, an end in view, and that God acts through the free actions, agents within history to accomplish that view, whereas Augustine does not have a teleological, or not as clearly a teleological view of history. I'm not sure if that's a way of thinking about the contrast, but Dr. Armstrong, you did mention that in one of the books, Augustine treats the end or the telos of the various cities, but I don't know that you followed up on that. So I'd be curious to know whether, and to what extent Augustine might also have a teleological view of these histories.
Good. I would need some precision of exactly what you mean by a teleological view of history. I'm familiar with the word.
Right. So the paradigm example would be Hegel.
Okay.
In history of philosophy.
Yep.
So, history and its wars and the fall and rise of states has an end goal in view.
Yeah.
And the agents within history are, for the most part, unaware of what that goal is. But there is a rational trajectory, and all of the various movements of history are in pursuit of that one goal. So, for example, the telos of history could be the triumph of the church. That would be one possibility.
Good.
But it also is possible that we are unaware of what that ultimate telos is, but we might want to affirm that there is a telos.
Good. I will fail to give you a satisfactory answer because I would say that all histories can't be written without a telos. So, and I know this is not, so come back at me so that I understand the distinction that you want to make, but I would say it's impossible to write a history except that the end be in place. How can you tell a story except that you're working towards a specific ending?
Sure.
Now, Augustine and Eusebius sometimes look so haphazard, you wonder if they have a goal. But I would say all histories have a specific telos.
Sure. I would want to push back a little bit and give you two alternatives.
Please.
One alternative would be a cyclical view of history, where there is no ultimate telos, but there are certain cycles, and certainly with the Old Testament view of history of Israel as falling away and coming back, and that happens repeatedly. And so, and also in the ancient world, there were cyclical views of history where every so often there'd be a conflagration, everything would burn down, and we'd start from scratch again. Another view of history would be, and perhaps you wouldn't even want to call this history, but an incoherent view of history, that we can talk about past events, but there really is no story. And so, perhaps you want to say that really isn't history unless you have some kind of narrative. But one might say that any narrative is artificially constructed, and that history really has no rationale to it whatsoever. So those would be two alternatives to a teleological view of history.
Good. Dr. Priest?
Well, so the second half, basically, the final 12 books of the City of God, as Jonathan suggested, devoted the first 4 to the origins, and the second 4 to the development, and the final 4 to the ends of these 2 cities, the heavenly city and the earthly city. So, for Augustine, there is, in a sense, a telos for history. but that will be in the parousia. Okay, that will be at the end time. And he writes works about the end time, what will be going on, so on and so forth. But those middle ones, which I guess are the ones that would be crucial for what we're asking about, it seems to be more of an inchoate history in the sense that it doesn't seem exactly to be going anywhere. What he says, though, is that there are these two cities, the earthly city and the heavenly city, and they struggle with each other. They're mixed up with each other, and they go along for however long God decides to let them go along, and then they will be separated, these two cities. So in the meantime, you're right, there's nothing Hegelian about those